and welcome back to Developers Toolbox. This talk today, we're going to be talking about user experience. I think I'd like to look at a few examples of some sites and some applications and talk about what's good and what's bad. So user experience, what is that? I'm sure everybody's heard user interface versus user experience, UI, UX. These are acronyms that appear pretty regularly all over the place, really. So what's the difference between a user interface or UI and user experience or UX? User interface is the actual things that you physically put on the screen for the user to interact with, right? Like your buttons and your inputs and your images and whatever else, the actual implementation of things on the screen. The user experience kind of sits over top of that. It's the way that users interact with your application or with your website or with your software as a whole. So user experience, when you hear that term, it is just kind of a buzzword, really, but there is an actual tangible difference between user experience and user interface. And they are closely related, but they're not necessarily codependent. We'll talk more about that in a little bit. But one thing that I really want to emphasize is that you can have good user experience without having good user interface, which is important for us as developers because we're not generally visually talented people. I'm not really sure how else to put it. For the most part, I mean, there's exceptions to that rule, but if you're not a graphics person and you're not really sure how to present things in a way that's aesthetically pleasing, that's okay. You can still implement a good user experience without having a good user interface, without having a visually appealing user interface, I should say. So user experience, really the most important thing is function over form. And you may have heard these expressions before, form over function and function over form. And what that means is that basically exactly what I was saying. It doesn't have to look pretty, but it has to do what users expect it to do. Things have to be obvious as far as if I click this button, if I'm going to type something in here, if I'm going to do this, if I'm going to do that, if I'm interacting with this site or this application in some way, it needs to do what I expect it to do. And if it does that, then at that point, it's good user experience. This can be kind of difficult because it really, there's a lot of dependency on who your user is. And we'll talk about that in a little bit too. But what's obvious to you might not be obvious to the user. So one of the things in terms of just making functionality obvious, there's a marketing term, and it's definitely a marketing thing, but I really like to kind of put this into practice on the design and implementation of software as well. There's this whole concept of a call to action. A call to action is basically you want to make it very, very clear where the user is to take action on inside of a view or on a web page. You want to make it very obvious where they need to take action and what action they need to take to interact with you. Usually, and how this applies in marketing is that you'll have a series of calls to action. So basically a series of steps for the user to interact with your website, with your organization, with your software, whatever it is. You have this series of steps where you want the user to interact, and you want them to interact in a way that's meaningful and both benefits them in some way, getting them the information they're looking for about your company or your product or whatever, but it also needs to benefit you in a way by making a simple series of steps and very obvious steps for users to interact with your content. You're also you're gathering information about that user, and you can kind of observe their behaviors and make certain assumptions and derive certain data from how that user is interacting as well. So having obvious calls to action is really the most important part of user experience, I think. And so I like to, like I said, implement that outside the scope of marketing. Just when you're building something, when you're building software, or even like just any kind of system that you're presenting to a user, you want to make it very obvious where they need to go to interact with different things and what those interactions look like and what they can expect. Having those calls to action be obvious is just as important in design of software as it is in web design and marketing. The next thing that I have is validation. And this is something that we always emphasize this, or at least I always emphasize this, and this is something that everybody should be thinking about as they're designing, especially anywhere where you're taking user input. And most commonly, that's going to be forms. where you have different inputs that the user needs to enter data into, different controls that they interact with in terms of buttons and things like that, links, images, basically places where the user needs to provide some kind of input. Validation is very important. I can certainly talk about validation in data models and where you should be doing validation in your application's business logic and that sort of thing. But right now we're just talking about front end stuff. So really client side validation is what I'm referring to here. And with client side validation, when I say that, what I mean is that like let's say you're presenting a form to a user. As they interact with that form, you should be giving them feedback in as close to real time as possible for the most part. We're going to be looking at an example of that. I think I want to, it wasn't actually on my original list of examples to look at, but I want to take a look at some validation rules that I have in place in Nexus in the create incident form. That's really, I think, a good example of how to provide good feedback to a user in terms of validation and validating their input. With validation, there's some different things that you have to consider. So one thing is like especially with forms validation, if a certain input is required, if a user is required to take an action, enter some input somewhere, you need to first off make that obvious right up front. So that whole this is typically you'll have like next to a label for a field, you'll have an asterisk maybe highlighted in red, something that really just brings it right to the user's attention right up front. This is a required field, or even just the word required somewhere, but just making it clear that the user has to put something into that field. And so that's pretty important. And then if the user ignores that kind of warning sign and doesn't put anything into that field and tries to continue with their actions, you need to make it obvious to them at that point, you missed something. Look over here and really kind of drive that field into view and highlight it in some way and give the user some kind of information about what's wrong with it. And specifically with required field validation, you definitely want to say required, or you need to put something here, some kind of message, something to the user to tell them, hey, this you need to do something here. There's an interaction that you missed that is necessary. But then that's not the only type of validation that I want to talk about either. There's also formatting validations. That's things like expression matching. So like if you have a field where a user has to type in a date, for example, you want to make sure that what they typed in looks like a date. So you have to have some kind of expression-based validation there to validate that input is in the format that it needs to be. And if it's not, again, you really need to call it to the user's attention. So you've got required fields, you've got expressions, you've got comparison validations, things where, like, let's say that you're working on an application where you have a form for like a search, and you have to put in maybe a start date and an end date for criteria for that search. It's good user experience or user interface design, depending on what school of thought you're coming from, to make sure that end date can't be prior to the start date. And that's something that it can be for certain users, and in certain contexts, it can be very, very easy to kind of mess that up and kind of swap dates around and put an end date that's before the start date. And again, let's say this is for implementation for a search feature in an application. User switches those dates around, they click search, they get no results. They're going to be kind of confused. So having a validation rule there that says, nothing is going to happen unless you follow these rules, and make that obvious to the user and call it to their attention if they still make a mistake. That's all kind of very important to the user experience, and it makes the user interaction much richer. It avoids frustration. It reduces support costs and support calls. If you really just make the rules clear to the user and kind of force them to follow them and make it very obvious when they haven't, that's what I'm talking about in terms of validation when it comes to user experience design. So you want to make sure that you're always putting the correct validations in place to get the results that the user is expecting and the behaviors that the user is expecting as they interact with the different pieces of your application. Does that make, or your website, or again, this is really kind of a general concept, and it doesn't even apply exclusively to software design, but that's the light in which I'm talking about it. So the next point that I had, and we've talked about this a little bit in the past, particularly with regards to communication in root cause analysis. Know your audience, understand who the target audience is, And in this case, I'm not talking about it purely in terms of communication, although that's certainly a factor here as well. But think about your audience and know your audience whenever you're designing sites and applications as well. So what you want to do as you're going through and designing and kind of testing your implementations and designing your user interface, and even before that, like if you're doing mockups, if you're doing stubbing, and you're just kind of prototyping things, as you're doing that, you should always be kind of stepping out of your own shoes and putting yourself into the user's shoes. Try and think about it from the user's perspective, and I think this is something that comes really naturally to some people, and for other people, it is just a totally alien concept and feels very weird to try and figure out how to do. But the idea is just, we tend to get like, we're deep into something, we're just kind of hacking away and coding, and we're not really thinking about what the result looks like from the user's perspective. We're just trying to get something done and make it work for us and make sense to us. But you should just really be pausing periodically. I like to take kind of a step where, as soon as I finish sort of a logical piece of a view, whether I'm designing it as a mock-up or a wireframe, or even if I'm just straight up building something, just when I get to a logical stopping point where I have sort of a completed component, completed view, completed form, whatever you want to call it, I kind of take a step back, clear my mind, kind of forget about everything that I know about what I just did, and just walk through the form or walk through that application, through that component, through that whatever, as though I'm seeing it for the first time with a fresh set of eyes, and just think, how does this feel? Does this seem natural to the person who's going to be using this? And you have to consider who the user is, because what seems right and feels right to one person may be different for a different person, and so you have to kind of consider more of a collective perspective. So this is the landing page for Facebook.com, and there's a few things that I want to highlight here, right in your face, pretty obvious. This is the whole call to action thing. It's pretty obvious what this page expects out of the user. So up here at the top right, you've got your email or phone and password entry, login, or forgot account for resetting password and stuff. Having this all kind of in one closely packed visual space makes it pretty obvious. This is one like kind of grouping of functionality. This is your call to action if you are already a user of Facebook and you're logging in. I mean, it just seems very obvious, but that's kind of the point, that this is really just there as soon as you hit Facebook.com. And if you're not already a user, sign up. Notice how the words sign up are in a larger font. And this is another thing, even outside that I didn't really talk about before, and I meant to touch on it, but I completely forgot. Even outside the scope of form fields and buttons and things like that are clearly interactable, there's something to be said for having good typography. So using the right fonts, using the right styling, and using the right sizing of text to call users' attention to things. It's pretty important in terms of the overall user experience, even beyond the stuff that they can actually interact with. So just the fact that this sign up is in a larger font, it automatically calls your eyes to that section. So a first-time user visiting Facebook.com, super common in this day and age. That's nobody's heard of this Facebook thing. But a first-time user visiting Facebook.com, this sign up being in a large font and being kind of up in your face, up at the top of the page, makes it really, really clear where you need to go if you're not already a user. And then, of course, there's some fluff here. It's quick and easy. Same thing here. Connect with friends and the world around you on Facebook, and some iconography here with details about what's entailed there. Just the way that the font is, or the way that the text is presented here, with the difference in fonts and sizes. The icons with these making it obvious that they're kind of bullet points under that heading, if you will. This is all good user experience design. This does tie into the marketing, obviously, and is really the purpose of this. But it still doesn't take away from the fact that this is just why one of the things that you should be thinking about with user experience is how you present text and image information to the user, because it really does make a difference. Well, first off, yeah, let's talk about that validation. So what happened there? So I'm obviously expected to enter my first name here. Now, it doesn't say right up front that this is a required field. So this is something that I would consider to be maybe some bad user experience to some degree. They're not making it obvious here what is required and what's not. When this page first loads, it's not immediately yelling at me for screwing up validation on this form, right? It doesn't happen until I do certain interactions. So I type in a first name, or even if I just click into the field, or if I focus the field, I should say, and blur the field, then that's when it starts yelling at me for validation. So, hey, I didn't put in a first name. That's required. And in addition to having these validations, there's also these kind of tooltips that, what's your name? Yeah, okay, it's very obvious what they're looking for here and what I'm doing wrong in just tabbing through this form and not actually filling out any of these fields. So that's one of the things I was talking about in terms of the validation rules, and how validation is important, how it needs to be obvious. So these fields are, whenever they have a validation failure, they get a red border, they get this red exclamation mark. So it's really, really obvious what I'm doing wrong here, and I need to put something into this field. And as soon as I start interacting with it, even if I just click into it before I start typing anything, you notice that red border goes away and that red exclamation mark goes away. So it's assumed this is actually kind of good user experience. It's assumed that I'm correcting whatever the error is, so it doesn't need to continue yelling at me. And you really want to update your validations in real time, especially when you're doing these kind of client-side validations. You want to have that updated in real time so that if the user fixes a problem, you don't keep yelling at them about that problem, because otherwise they're just going to be confused and they're going to try and, well, yeah, obviously I did something wrong here, blah, blah, blah. That's the kind of get the idea. And again, all this stuff seems really obvious, but whenever you're kind of in the heat of doing user interface implementation, whenever you're doing design, you don't necessarily think about these things. You don't think about the validation as really often an afterthought, and but it's something that if you think about it as you're doing the implementation and as you're doing the design and making these interactions work in this way up front, you save yourself a lot of headaches in the long term. The only other thing that I wanted to cover here, the sign up button, is again, it's a different color than everything else on the page. It's green. It doesn't follow the regular color palette in terms of the blues that we see on here. It's really obvious that when I'm done with this form and I fix these problems, I need to click this sign up button. And another thing that happens when I do that, if there's any validation that needs to happen that hasn't triggered already, you'll notice it wasn't yelling at me about gender before because I hadn't made a selection down here. I hadn't interacted with this in any way, so it wasn't yelling at me. But as soon as I go to sign up without having completed that validation, it's making it very clear to me, hey, wait, you need to do this before you can click that button again. You need to make sure that you've completed this part of the form. One thing that I do not like, that I think is bad user experience design, and I have seen a lot, maybe people disagree with me on this. I'm not sure if it's really a contentious topic or not, but these are HTML text fields. They're HTML inputs. And with HTML5, there is an attribute for input for placeholder text, which is really, really useful. So where it says first name right now, if I type in, that goes away. That's what's called placeholder text. And these fields are labeled using placeholders. So this is the first name field, this is the last name field, and we can tell that based on the placeholders. But as soon as I put something in there and I go away, now it's no longer obvious what this field does. So I don't know that this is a first name anymore, which is not terrible, I guess, especially considering I've already completed this form field. But I do think it's bad design to stop or to use placeholders for labeling of fields. I think that they should have labels. They can have placeholders as well. Maybe some placeholders I think are more appropriate for examples. So maybe instead of having the placeholder text for this input be first name, have it be John, and last name instead of that have it be Doe, something like that to make it just lend some context to what the field is for, but move the first name and last name fields out of, or first name and last name labels out of here to the actual labels beside the form field instead of placeholder text. I think that would be good. Another good technique that a good user experience technique I've seen done is using labels in such a way that And I've done this recently with a couple of mobile apps, using labels in such a way that they look like placeholders. So basically, you overlay the label over top of the field so it looks like a placeholder. But then once you focus the field and start putting stuff in, animate the label and have it move kind of up above the field and shrink down. So at that point, it's more of an outside the field label. And that way, as you complete a form, you can still see what each field is for, but it has this same kind of look and feel of having placeholder, even though it's not actually a placeholder. So with the create incident form in Nexus, I have some validation rules in place here. It's all required field validation. So I don't, you don't yell at the same thing as we looked at with the Facebook example. You don't yell at people up front for failing validations. You wait until they do stuff. But unlike the Facebook one, if I focus and start doing something with the field and then stop interacting with it, if I have still failed that validation, I don't do anything right away. And there's upsides and downsides to that. And I think this comes back to the whole knowing your audience and what they're expecting sort of thing. And this is based largely on historical behavior for how SIM worked in the past and how we brought the functionality from SIM into Nexus. It's just people don't expect to see validation errors after interacting with a control until they reach a stopping point. SIM has that whole flow of you're doing a piece of work, and then whenever you click save or create or add or whatever the button says, only at that point is that information submitted from that form, and it follows that sort of historical forms mentality. So that's why I did the validation the way I did here. Now, when you go to submit the form, if you have failed validations at that point, then at that point it makes it very obvious where things are broken. So I have validation messages. I probably maybe should be displaying these inline on the form, but just for the reasons of space constraints and to make sure that this is friendly on mobile, I just put the validation messages at the bottom. So and that's right below the button that they just clicked. So it does call their attention to, hey, here's what you missed. But then the other thing, I apply a red highlight on each of the fields that's failing validation to make that obvious. And again, this is more similar to the Facebook example. If I go in here and actually fix a validation error, I've selected a company now, and so at this point I'm passing validation. So I get rid of that red background. I get rid of the validation message for that field. So the user knows at this point, okay, I fixed the problem. You don't want to keep those, and that's something that I have seen in other places, keeping those validation error messages and validation notification changes in place after the user has already fixed the issue and only wiping it out when they submit the form again. You don't want to do that. You want to make it obvious that they have indeed fixed the problem. So some things to note about the Reddit user interface. Let's see. So we're looking at, this is reddit.com. This is the main landing page. This isn't a specific sub, but we're just looking at reddit.com, and so like kind of just paging through here. Let's say that and Reddit is one where people struggle to understand how to use Reddit to begin with, but I don't think it's necessarily because of Reddit's user interface or experience. It's more maybe just not understanding terminology. The calls to action are actually not bad here. So up at the top, you have a place where you can search, and that's I think it's expected for new users just coming here to they're looking for something and you don't necessarily know what it is that they're looking for, so you might make some suggestions. But really, the search dialog is outstanding user experience design, in my opinion, because as soon as we focus this field, we get some suggestions before we've even typed anything, just for what's popular, what's trending today, they say, and they even put the text trending today there, so you know this isn't just random stuff that they've decided to display here. This is stuff that's trending today.